Nostalgia is a powerful force. I have to admit, in my 10 years as a gamer, there have been certain times where I've completely overlooked a game due to nostalgia. Upon replaying certain games as I get older, I've discovered how terrible some games actually are. Pac Man World 3, unfortunately, is one of those games. This is the very thesis of a bad game. It does almost everything wrong, from the aggravating combat, mediocre levels, and odd shift of tone for not only the Pac Man World series, but for Pac-Man in general. The first two Pac Man World games, of course, were fun, great, and colorful platformers that were really enjoyable. However, this game really gets far away from those original concepts, which begs the question, what went wrong with this game? Well, it turns out it was never intended to be a Pac Man World game, but rather a new sub-series called Pac Man Adventures. This cancelled project featured work from the renowned animator Don Bluth. He's best known for his work on the animated films The Land Before Time and All Dogs Go to Heaven. In terms of games he's developed, he worked on the Dragon's Lair series and Space Ace. You know the ones. You pop a quarter or two in and watch a pretty wicked animation, kind of like a QuickTime event in today's gaming terms. Don Bluth designed the early concepts for what Pac-Man Adventures would have been, including Pac-Man losing control, whatever that would have meant, in an odd adaptation of the character from Dig Dug. They ended up scrapping the project and Don Bluth was let go, but his influences do appear in the final game based on these weird creatures and architectural type levels he designed. At the very least, his tone remained present. It can be inferred that whatever Pac-Man Adventures had completed became Pac Man World 3. We can also infer that this may have been an attempt by Namco to save a few pennies while still releasing a new Pac Man World game. This leads to my theory that they were trying to cheap out on production, since also they hired a new studio rather than an in-house one, being Blitz Games, to produce it. Now, I'm not saying Blitz Games is a bad publisher necessarily or anything. There were far worse out there, but the games that they made when they were around definitely gave off some shovelware vibes. They worked on a lot of games that were based on other franchises and TV shows. Namco, most likely in an effort to save some money, threw the game to this developer and gave them whatever assets they had left from Pac Man Adventures and hoped it would work out. Yeah, what could go wrong? This game was put onto pretty much any platform under the sun: Xbox, PS2, Gamecube, PC, PSP, and even the Nintendo DS. Why not just put it on the Genesis at that point? When discussing Pac Man World 3, we need to start off with the elephant in the room. This game's tone is completely different than what you'd expect from any type of Pac-Man game. This starts promptly with the title screen. Just take a look. Not only is it drab, generic, and void of happiness, it's totally not what you'd expect from a Pac Man World game. Pac-Man is a character that thrives upon joy. Every game cover that he's been in, he's been smiling. He's Pac-Man after all, he's the Munch Man. And don't get me wrong, he's happy in this game, so it's not like he's out of character. But the world around him is out of character. The levels and music are so depressing. It's like Blitz Games never played a Pac-Man game before and didn't know how to fill out the levels, so they just made up some barren wastelands and radioactive themes combined with whatever Don Bluth had previously given them. Take a look at these types of levels. We have the aforementioned radioactive pit and barren wasteland. There's a building on fire, the ghost home known as the Spectral Realm. This doesn't look like Pac-Man. This serves as one of the game's main issues. You could really place any character in this game's levels and you would have never been able to tell that this was a Pac-Man game. The story for this game, while dark and out of place, is actually pretty amusing. Erwin, an evil genius, is attempting to take the energy out of the Spectral Realm, which is collapsing inward on Pac-Land. Our chummy hero, who was celebrating his birthday with his family, gets teleported by Orson, who was also in the first Pac Man World game, to save the world. Poor guy can't celebrate a milestone birthday without some sort of chaos erupting. As the game progresses, we learn Erwin is following in the steps of the ancient civilization when they almost destroyed the world, except in Erwin's case, he's doing it on purpose. The characters in this game are actually well written. There's Pac-Man, of course, which... oh, wait. A talking Pac-Man. Oh yeah. Yeah, all jokes aside, Pac-Man is pretty funny.
Uh-oh! I'm detecting a rise in energy in your sector, Pac-Man.
Details of my sector's energy should be between me and Miss Pac. Thank you very much.
He comes off as a second-rate Sonic the Hedgehog to me, but he knows how to joke around and is never a downer. Martin Sherman, while a little nasally, I think did a great performance as Pac-Man. He's always so positive, even when the world around him is ending. There are far worse gaming protagonists you could play as than this iteration of Pac-Man. So Orson, he comes off as a nerd but also performs as a trustworthy ally to Pac Man. The ghosts in this game I feel are some of the best written characters. Clyde and Pinky speak in New Jersey accents, which is just funny. They labeled Clyde as the Red Ghost, which is a mistake to anyone who played the original Pac Man, which again shows that maybe the publishers didn't exactly have their bearings straight on the franchise. Blinky and Inky are barely in this game, but nevertheless do appear and have some lines. Pinky, after you save her in the 3rd level, never speaks again after the 4th level. I always found this weird. It felt like they cheaped out on her voice actor, and also that her character had little relevance to the whole story. Definitely an odd choice if you ask me. Clyde, on the other hand, is probably the best written out of all the ghosts. Him and Pac Man have a funny rivalry, so they're always bickering throughout the rest of the game, which is classic. Throughout the game, we also get other side characters that help Pac Man out in a particular level that they're in. The characters are pretty well written, albeit used sparsely, and again, don't necessarily fit into the Pac Man cinematic universe. These characters talk to each other as you play, which I always enjoy. This is a well-written game. Even if the majority of the time I hated the gameplay and went through most of this game miserable and desolate, I was at least grinning like a chimp at the funny things these characters had to say to each other. The story isn't immersive like a Final Fantasy game, which it doesn't have to be, but it isn't shallow like, say, a Super Mario game. I'd argue that the story is better than some Sonic games, to compare the franchises yet again. It feels like a typical Saturday morning cartoon type of plot, which is exactly what I'd expect out of this type of game. If they were going to add voices and a story to Pac Man, this is probably the best that I could expect. The gameplay isn't inherently bad in Pac Man World 3. Pac Man himself actually controls like a dream. Well, maybe not a dream, but a decent nightmare. He jumps and moves fluently and properly. He also has a good arsenal of moves himself as well. Pressing the A button multiple times allows you to butt bounce and destroy boxes, vases, the whole kit and caboodle. They did nerf this from Pac Man World 2 and 1. You no longer get any type of height off of it. Pressing the B button allows you to punch. Great. And pressing the X button allows you to revel. Both can be used to hurt enemies around you. The main issue in this game isn't the controls or the story, but rather it's the combat. The combat in this game is some of the worst gameplay that I've ever experienced in any video game. There's a few main problems with the combat in this game. There's very little ways to fight the enemies. The main method of attack is the puny little punch that Pac Man has. You can use the revel and you can use the butt bounce, but rarely is that the best way to fight these guys. There are certain power-ups you can get, but these don't do much in the way of helping with these drab combat sections. So there's a ribbon loop power-up which lets you make circles around the enemies, thus destroying them. This is cool looking and it gives you a little bit of a speed boost. There's a super stomp power which gives you a pretty big butt bounce, destroying the enemies around you. There's also an electric shock power pellet that lets you zap enemies. This is the only one that has any use outside of combat, letting you power up machines around you to progress. There's also a chrome power pellet that gives you a brief invincibility phase. However, these aren't enough to make the combat interesting in my opinion. A game that does combat well uses more than just a basic punch, one button as a basic attack. Even the GTA games at least use 3 buttons. There's no real combo system. There's no real way to merge attacks. It would at least not be so monotonous if there were grabs, combos, etc. At least then the game would have had fighter elements. In Pac Man World 3, it's plain as day that this game isn't actually a fighter, but rather a platformer that desperately tried to add fighter elements. As such, most combat sections pan out like this in this game. The main issue with the combat is that you can't defend yourself in any way. The only way to quote-unquote defend yourself is to run away from the enemies like a coward. This is a big issue. The game wants you to focus on combat, but there's no way to defend yourself and only one main way to attack. Platformers can do combat right, but they need these basic functions to thrive. The sections with the enemies go on for way too long. There will be certain points during the game where the platforming crawls to a screeching halt and you have to fight more enemies. This wouldn't be a huge deal, but these fighting sequences can last anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes and absolutely destroy the pace of the game. There are some enemies you can just ignore, but then there are some you need to kill to either progress or because rev-rolling a platform with them around is impossible. Again, this kills the pace with the game. The levels drag on for way too long due to this. You'll be minding your own business, maybe even slightly enjoying the game, and then bam, a swarm of these guys. Every time that I saw the enemies in this game, I got annoyed and wanted to turn the game off. Not only are the enemies constant, but they're repetitive as well. Worst of all these enemies are the ancient defenders. The game throws so damn many of these things at you, and each one takes about 1,000,000 hits to kill. I lost my mind trying to take these things on. They're so constant and repetitive. In this game, there are also segments where you chase ghosts with power pellets. At first, I actually thought that this was pretty clever, since the areas are just like maze levels in 3D from the original Pac Man, and it was actual Pac Man source material. However, these are just as monotonous and repetitive as the actual combat. You have to grab the power pellet, chase the ghosts, rinse and repeat. It's like playing a game of tag. The spawn limit of these ghosts are limited to 4 at a time, so again this brings down the pace of the game to a screeching halt as you wait around for more to come out. The pellets take forever to respawn as well, having you sit around waiting. Again, the problem with this is that they pop up so frequently that it kills the pace of the entire game. It's not fun gameplay. Combine it with the generic enemies that pop up frequently, and this game is just a slogfest, and it never ends. These 2 combat sections of the game nearly kill the game and ruin it for me. This is the problem with Pac Man World 3 at its core. Platforming wise, this game is okay. The game does barely enough to keep it interesting between the levels, but it's just so simple. If you can jump with any type of confidence, you can pretty much beat Pac Man World 3. There are all the basics, bouncy pads that send you in a predetermined direction, pack pellet loops that take you to certain places, basic puzzles, but these are all generic and mindless. As long as you move forward, you can beat Pac Man World 3. It requires very little skill. Keep this in mind to contrast with Pac Man World 2, which was a game where you had to be pretty good to beat the levels. In this game, you just have to be able to hold a controller. It's easy. I don't mean to rag on the game just for being easy. There's plenty to enjoy in a simple game. But when there's literally no challenge besides not trying to fall asleep and try not to get frustrated due to the repetitive nature of the combat, then this game does something wrong. Like I said, the platforming isn't bad, but it's certainly not good or necessarily creative. Oh boy, there was this one section that was timed. A bomb was about to go off and you had to climb to the top to stop it. Every time that I died, and this was a long segment by the way, I had to climb all the way back up. This means fighting all the enemies again and again and again. Have some mercy, I almost threw the game out of my window at this point. New to Pac Man World 3, you can actually play as Clyde and Pinky. Clyde can shoot beams at ghosts when there aren't any actual Pac pellets nearby, and can also knock over platforms to help Pac-Man progress through the levels. Clyde makes killing ghosts even more monotonous, however, believe it or not. You can just press the B button over and over again. Pinky, on the other hand, can materialize platforms that Pac-Man can't see to again, help him progress through the levels. Pinky can only materialize 3 platforms at a time, making each section that she's in a puzzle. Rarely are her puzzles very interesting, unfortunately. They never do anything too crazy with either ghosts. To me, I always wondered why they even bothered adding them when they have so much potential that was never tapped. Musically, this game is a mixed bag. It's not necessarily bad or anything, but it's way too ambient and weirdly situational. What I mean by that is sometimes you'll be enjoying the game, minding your own business, and then the music comes to a screeching halt and you'll just be playing the level in silence. They didn't know how to make it loop. Some of these tracks weren't even that bad. Again, they're very ambient-like, which does fit the tone of the game fairly well. I just wish that the soundtrack was more consistent and actually played throughout the entire game. It almost felt like they ran out of time with the music at some points, since a lot of music is either reused or, like I said, sometimes there's no music at all. Another issue with the audio in this game is that it's not very well mixed. A majority of the time when the characters are talking, it's impossible to hear them because the mixing is so bad. I wouldn't know what was happening if it wasn't for the captions. Take a listen at this.
Why not? Single-handedly, I'm against the kind of but still I try.
Yeah, and there's always that second chance.
I actually didn't think this game was that bad looking graphically. As much as the levels didn't fit the tone of what Pac Man was, they looked pretty cool. Sure, some textures are muddy, and some levels actually do look pretty bad in fact, but overall I think the game comes out on top. The lighting reflects off of Pac Man frequently, especially in the Spectral Realm, which I thought was pretty cool. Actually, the whole Spectral Realm levels, as unfitting as they are, look pretty cool. The ghosts, the spectrums they come from, as much as I hated these sections, also looked pretty slick. Graphically, I I think it's the best looking, maybe not in terms of style, but of pure graphics, out of the 3 games. I was very impressed with this game releasing in 2005 and looking pretty on par with what was to come later. There are collectibles throughout the game's levels which are scattered pretty much anywhere. Sometimes they get pretty creative with the location of the fruits and you really have to scratch your head to find them, but other times they're right out in the open or can just be found by butt bouncing a crate. There are also trophies, 5 of them in each level to be exact, that can be found throughout the level, and a trading card as well that you can view in your gallery. Collecting all the fruits and trophies just gets you more trading cards. Great. The trading cards are a big letdown in this game. It would have been nice if they had a description on them, kind of like the trophies from Super Smash Bros., but instead all you get is a pixelated image that barely represents what the card is supposed to be. They put a minimal amount of effort into this section of the game, which is disappointing since these are your really only prizes for beating the game. The only real purpose the collectibles serve besides trading cards are points. Yeah, this game has a point system to it. I get why they added it since it's the Pac Man game and all, but come on. This really isn't the type of game that even needs points. It's a platformer. There's a whole high score section in the game and it feels so freaking superfluous. I personally gave up on the collectibles after the first few levels since I felt like there was little point to them and I wanted to focus on the platforming and just finishing this boring game. There is one more type of collectible, the Galaxian. Upon collecting this, you are transported to an original Pac Man type maze, but oh boy. The Ghost's AI is so bad in these. They don't move around with any rhyme or reason like they did in the original arcade release. They roam around like a bunch of flying monkeys. Plus the graphics here just look bad in my opinion. The mazes are way too easy as well. Since the Ghost couldn't care less about chasing you most of the time, it gives you plenty of time to munch the pellets and power pellets. There are also power-ups in these mazes you can collect to slow down the Ghost, speed up Pac Man, and also there's a spider that runs around the maze and drops more power pellets. What a jerk. There's also sections in this game, 2 to be exact, where you get to take hold of a giant robot from the first Pac Man World game, Talk Man. These sections are just boring. Just watch the footage. I have very little to actually say besides you just spam the trigger buttons and the B button. Did the producers actually think that this would be fun? Seriously? To me, it just screams that they were under pressure to add some more levels to the game and didn't know how else to pad the game. And that's the best way to describe Pac Man World 3. Padding. The game feels padded. You fight ghosts. Padding. You fight bad guys. Padding. You do random mech fighting button mashing. Padding. And even then, the game is only 6 to 7 hours. This game doesn't have anything to it, unfortunately. It's void of substance. There's 2 boss fights in this game. These are incredibly repetitive and frustrating for all the wrong reasons. During the first Erwin fight, you walk around to 3 rev roll panels and then butt bounce the boss until it kicks you out, and then rinse and repeat. He does send some troops after you, but they don't add much to the fight besides a few extra jumps you need to perform to avoid them. The final boss is very similar, which makes the whole game kind of anticlimactic. The only difference is that there are 4 rev roll panels instead of 3. Brilliant! It's also very glitchy. The hitbox on the robot never worked for me during the fight. I felt very frustrated since, to be honest, I just wanted to beat this game and never look back. In this game, there's a museum you can go to view all your cards, as I mentioned earlier. Also in this room you can play the original Pac Man. No joke, this might be the best part of the entire game. I'm not kidding. You can also take a look at the history of the Pac Man games released up to this date. I like this feature a lot. I really enjoyed reading about all the different Pac Man games. Also in this museum you can see a history of Pac Man from the creator of the series, which was a very interesting watch. It begs the question though, what would the creator think of this game? I think he'd be disappointed. Pac Man World 3, again, is a bad game. I don't want to hate this game, but I do. It wouldn't be so bad, but the combat kind of kills the entire game, kind of. There's just so much of it. Some platforms, such as Sonic Unleashed, do combat right to the point where it's not drab and frustrating. However, Pac Man World 3 is not one of those games. I struggle to even call this game a platformer due to half the time you aren't even platforming. Worst of all, this game completely persuaded me into thinking it was something it wasn't due to my nostalgia. In conclusion, this game is a letdown. It's not as bad as, say, Sonic 06, but definitely not as good as a Sonic Adventure game. If I were to make a comparison on the Sonic scale, I'd probably say it's equivalent to Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyrics. It's disappointing that the Pac Man World trilogy had to end on such a bad note, but there is value to be seen in the game. The graphics and the music are pretty good, and you can play the original Pac Man in this game. It's not a total waste of your time. It's definitely a mixed bag, unfortunately. That's Pac Man World 3, a mixed bag.